Hello friends, and welcome to this class on Introduction to Computer Hardware. In this tutorial, you will be introduced to some of the commonest and most vital computer hardware devices and their functions. By the end of this class, 1. You should be able to identify these hardware devices when you see them. Number 2. When you take your PC to be fixed by a technician, at least when he mentions any of them, you should be able to understand what he says. Number 3. You should be able to recognize what the problem might be in the case of a malfunction. Number 4. You will be able to appreciate what their roles and functions are. Number 5. You should know how to better take care of your computer for longevity. Number 6. And for pretty much other reasons that may be peculiar to your interests. So, without further delay, let's jump in.
Okay, before we move ahead, let's make a highlight of the hardware devices that we'll be discussing in this lecture. Number 1 is the hard disk drive. Number 2 is RAM. Number 3 is the processor. Number 4, the power supply unit. Number 5, optical disk drive. Number 6, IDE cable. Number 7, SATA cable. Further down in the lecture, we're going to know the meanings of these acronyms. Number 8 is the keyboard. Number 9 is the mouse. Number 10 is CMOS battery. Number 11 is the motherboard. And number 12, and the final one, is the computer case. The casing that encloses the rest of the hardware of your computer. Okay, let's move ahead. And we begin with the hard disk drive, or hard drive. Hard disk drive is the main storage component of your PC. It is the actual hardware or part of your PC that stores all the files and data on your computer. In other words, when you take pictures and videos with your phone and transfer them to your PC, or type documents or design graphics or install software applications, they are all stored on the hard drive of your PC. The operating system, OS, of course, as a software, is also stored on the hard disk drive. This is why when your hard disk drive is bad, your computer would not be able to boot. Note, hard disk drive is the most fragile part of the computer. Hence, you can help them last longer by making sure your computer doesn't suffer any mechanical impact, or that your hard disk drive or computer as a whole unit doesn't fall or hit on a hard object. Okay, the next hardware in our arsenal would be the RAM. You may have at one time or another heard of the term RAM. Example, 2 gig RAM or 4 gig RAM or whatever gig RAM. Perhaps when you buy a phone, they tell you your phone is 2 gig RAM or 32 gig of RAM, or whatever gig of RAM that it has. It is the hardware in your computer responsible for making tasks run in a speedy manner. Typically, when your PC is running tasks, there are bits of information and data that it constantly needs to run these tasks. But all the data and information, as we have mentioned earlier, are all stored in the hard disk drive, and having to retrieve them as often as the computer needs them would be terribly daunting and sluggish. Hence, the need for the RAM. The RAM typically temporarily stores data that is in active use so that the computer can quickly and repeatedly access them as it's running tasks. This way, the PC would continue to run its tasks without delay, since it does not have to scout through all the data on the hard disk drive to get to the one it constantly needs for a given operation. This is also why the more RAM you have on your PC, the faster your PC can perform, because the bigger RAM can store more temporal data as the PC works. Sometimes, however, when the RAM is full, the computer dynamically uses a portion of the hard disk drive as RAM to support the main RAM. This is called VRAM, or virtual RAM. Note, In a future lecture, we'll explain how a computer calculates sizes and stores its data. Alright, the next hardware is the processor or CPU. Sometimes people confuse the word or acronym CPU with the computer casing. This is not to be. They are two different things. CPU is the processor and the casing is the casing. Alright. The processor or the central processing unit is the component responsible for conducting all the computer operations. Computer processing involves a wide range of complicated mathematical, logical, control, input and output tasks that translate to the individual and group operations and tasks that the PC performs, or that we often use our computers to perform. These wide varieties of complicated tasks is usually referred to as processing, and the sole hardware responsible for these is the processor. Okay? Note, due to the high heat demand of processors, they usually have fans to help them with cooling and heat dissipation. Okay? The processor generates a lot of heat, yes. Sometimes your PC can be classified by the type of processor it has. For example, single core processor, dual core processor, quad core processor, hexacore processor. Under the quad and hexacore categories, you have things like Core i3, Core i5, Core i7. Sometimes, when you buy a computer, you see that it is Core i3, Core i5, or Core i7. Perhaps in a future lecture, we'll talk about what these cores are and how they work. Alright, the next hardware in line would be the power supply unit, or PSU. As the name implies, the power supply unit is the component of the PC which provides and manages power for the computer system. In a typical desktop PC, it supplies the motherboard with power so that all other components can then get their respective power supply needs from the motherboard. In a desktop PC, the power supply component comes with an inbuilt fan which helps with cooling the system. Alright, there's the desktop power supply and there's the laptop power supply that we know. Okay? Alright, the next hardware in line would be the ODD, optical disk drive. The ODD, or the CD-ROM drive, is an input-output device used to write or read information to or from a CD-ROM. CD-ROM is the normal disk that you know, the CD disk, compact disk, the disk that you use on a daily basis, that you play in your cars, in your TVs and video machines, and the rest of them, or your computer, of course. Okay? Many devices in a computer are usually classified either as input or output devices. An input device is one with which you can input or write or transfer or save information into the PC, while an output device is one with which you can read or access or get or take information from the PC. See? Input or output. Yeah. To input or to output. Very simple, isn't it? In computer terms, the word read simply means to access or get or take information, while the word write means to save or record information. Good. Okay, the next in line is the IDE cable. IDE is an acronym that stands for Integrated Drive Electronics. IDE cables are cables used to connect storage devices such as hard disk drive, optical disk drive, and floppy drives to the motherboard. So those devices that we've mentioned, IDE cable is what you use to connect them to the motherboard. Okay, devices like hard disk drive, optical disk drive, and floppy, of course, for older systems. Okay, so IDE cables, that's the cable that helps us make the connection between the motherboard and these devices that I've mentioned before. Okay? However, they are being phased out and the newer SATA type cables are mostly now in use. Okay, here we have SATA cable, the next hardware. SATA is an acronym for Serial Advanced Technology Attachment, or Serial ATA, SATA cable. SATA cable is a newer type of cabling used to connect storage devices to each other and to the motherboard. So, like we earlier mentioned about the IDE cable, SATA cables are now more in use. They are newer to the IDE cables and they are also used to connect devices such as the hard disk drive, the optical drive, and so on. Okay, the next hardware is the keyboard. We should all be familiar with the keyboard because we make use of them on a daily basis on our mobile devices. The keyboard is classified as an input device because it is one of the hardware components that we use to make inputs to the computer. When we write or type texts, we are simply making inputs to the computer, as we have hinted earlier. To new computer users, the keyboard is often very overwhelming, but in a future lecture, we will try and demystify the keyboard by extensively explaining different parts and what they do. We shall also be discussing the mouse with a bit more detail. There are various kinds of keyboards based on their layouts, and we shall also look into this in an upcoming keyboard tutorial. Alright. Okay, the next hardware in line will be the mouse. The mouse is also very common, just as the keyboard is. We primarily use the mouse for navigating within the computer. We use it to move around the user interface, point at and select options, and so on and so forth. Okay, right on the user interface, or the GUI, meaning graphical user interface. It is also classified as an input device since it aids with making inputs to the PC. Okay? A standard mouse has 3 buttons. 1. The left click button. 2. The right click button. 3. The scroll wheel. Alright, the next hardware in line is the CMOS battery. Some call it the CMOS memory. It's an acronym, CMOS, CMOS battery, CMOS memory. The CMOS battery or CMOS memory is a type of small memory in a typical computer. CMOS is an acronym for complementary metal oxide semiconductor. The function of the CMOS battery or CMOS memory is to store the settings of a computer, the BIOS settings. BIOS means basic input-output systems. Now, the CMOS memory stores the settings of a computer BIOS, such as date, time, and configuration details of the computer. Current configuration details of the computer, as it were. You see, sometimes you may notice that when your computer goes off unexpectedly, or when you start your computer, that your system time is incorrect. This is usually an indication that your CMOS battery has gone bad and needs to be replaced. In other words, the CMOS battery is responsible for storing this information that we've mentioned earlier. Things like date, time, and the rest of them. So, when you put on your computer, or say you use your computer a day before by 4 p.m., for instance, when you put on your computer the next day by 12 p.m. or 12 a.m., as the case may be, your computer time is still synchronized with the real world time. Okay? So, in other words, your computer time is still correct. That is the function of the CMOS battery. It stores this information and continues to synchronize the time information so that when you switch your computer back on, your computer time remains correct, just like every other time information. Alright, the next hardware in line would be the motherboard or mainboard. As the name implies, it is simply the motherboard of your computer. It is the main circuit board of the PC to which all other devices and hardware are connected. So, all these devices that we've mentioned, they all connect together on the motherboard. All of them are connected to the motherboard. That's why it's called the main board, okay? The motherboard is a circuit board, just like circuit boards that you see in other electronic devices. but we call it the motherboard. In real-world example, the motherboard will be likened to the floor of a house on which all kinds of properties, equipment, appliances, furniture are placed or mounted or erected. The motherboard makes it possible for all other hardware components to be connected in a functional manner and provides outlets through the computer case where we connect our own external devices such as phones using USB cables, USB flash drives or removable disks, monitors, USB mouse, USB keyboards, earpiece, headsets, network cables, projectors, etc. Okay? So, when you plug or connect stuffs behind your PC or on your laptop, you're simply connecting it to a port that is attached to the motherboard. Alright. So, the next and the final one is the computer case. Computer case or computer casing, more like saying container, alright, is simply the containing piece of metal box that houses all computer hardware components. So all these hardware components that we've talked about, they are enclosed in the computer case, okay? They all live inside the case, including the motherboard and the rest of them, okay? That's it. In a real-world example, the computer case will be likened to a house, okay? We equated the motherboard to the floor of a house, but in this case, the computer case is equated to the main house itself. In a house, there will be properties, household appliances, and furniture, and there will be the floor on which these items will stand, be erected or mounted. That's it. Okay, so that thing that most people erroneously call or confuse as the CPU, sometimes you hear people say the CPU, and they're referring to the case as computer casing, and they're saying CPU. It's not the CPU, it's the computer casing itself. The CPU is actually tiny stuff, of course, that we know of, that is inside the PC doing the heavy lifting or most of the work, alright? Most desktop PCs are equipped with fans to help cool the various hardware components on the motherboard and to dissipate excess heat. So, that is that for that concerning that. Alright, so, overview. Now we're going to place the motherboard and the computer casing side by side for you to be able to see the ports as they project outside the computer case, and then you see some of the ports available and where they are located. Alright? Good. Alright, there you go. See, that's the motherboard itself on the left side, and that's the computer case housing the motherboard on the left. Alright, so that motherboard on the left is what you have right inside that casing on the right. Alright, and so you can see the ports, the corresponding ports as they are. So the motherboard is outside, but the other one is inside. So we're now showing you the ports as they have protruded from the casing. We're now showing you, how they are, okay, with the motherboard and the casing itself. So the first label that we have is the PS2 keyboard and mouse ports. So that's the old type port where we used to connect the old type of mouse and keyboard, the PS2 ports. Okay, but these days we don't use them anymore because these days we have USB technology. So we have most hardware devices come with USB connection. So we just plug them into a USB port. So that's how it is, all right? Okay, so we also have the VGA port or video port, okay, where we connect video appliances like projectors and other monitors, right? Then we also have the USB ports themselves. There are about 4 of them, 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, you can see the way they are behind the computer, and you can see them, the corresponding ports on the motherboard on the left. Right. So we also have the network port or Ethernet port, if you like. That's that there. Okay. And we also have the audio ports where we connect your headphones and headsets and audio devices. All right. Okay, on the other side of the casing itself, we also have the PSU, the power supply units that we talked about, that manages and supplies power to the motherboard. Okay, so that's also the power port where you connect the computer to the power source. Okay, that power port is also on the PSU. Okay, it only makes sense that the power port is on the PSU because PSU is the power manager of the PC. Okay. Then a little further down, we also have the PC fan. Okay, where the fan is located. Okay, where the fan of the computer that helps with cooling and heat dissipation is located. Okay, so that's that for that concerning that. All right, a few ways to take care of your computer for longevity. Okay, number one, always keep the computer at a location where there is sufficient inflow of air. Number two, for laptops with underneath vents, avoid keeping them on a mattress while they're in use. Rather, keep them on a flat surface that allows for inflow of air. Number three, avoid dropping or carrying your computer in a rough manner. Number four, do not allow the hard disk drive to be hit by a hard object or surface. Number five, do not use them under the direct rays of the sun. Number six, ensure that the right or recommended power supply unit with recommended power rating is used. Number seven, avoid installing incompatible programs and remove unnecessary programs. Number eight, use good antivirus programs and keep them frequently updated. Number nine, periodically get rid of dust, especially around the fans and vents, using air blower. Alright, it's glossary time. CMOS, complementary metal oxide semiconductor. CPU, central processing unit. GB, gigabyte. GPU, graphics processing unit. HDD, hard disk drive. HW, hardware. IDE, integrated drive electronics. KB, kilobyte. MB, megabyte. MB, motherboard. ODD, optical disk drive. PC, personal computer. PSU, power supply unit. RAM, random access memory. SATA, serial advanced technology attachment. SW, software. Okay, so that announces the end of our lecture. Remember to follow our YouTube channel and to follow us on Twitter so you'll be updated with future lecture publications. Subscribe, like, and feel free to share. Thank you for listening, viewing, and following.